All right, more updates on the NSA. First, Glenn Greenwald saying, no, the story's bigger than you think. Quote, all an analyst has to do is enter an email address or an IP address, and it does two things. It searches the database and lets them listen to the calls or read the emails of everything that the NSA has stored, or look at the browsing histories or Google search terms that you've entered, and it also alerts them to any further activity that people connected to that email address or that IP address do in the future. So let me explain that disaster. So he's saying even the private contractors, and remember there's over 1 million people who have access to classified information like this, can simply find an IP address or an email address and then go and find all of your content. Now, of course, the government says, oh, we would never. How about your private contractors? Oh, they would never. But there's like 1.3 million of them. Never. Greenwald's not convinced. He continues to say, while the overarching surveillance programs require FISA court approval, analysts can use individual tools and systems to spy on Americans with no need to go to a court and with no need to even get a supervisor approval on the part of the analyst. So that's lovely. You don't need a specific warrant. They can go ahead and get it. Now, might they get in trouble for it? Maybe. Do they have access to it? Yes. Will someone eventually abuse it, whether it's for political reasons or because they want to see what's in Angelina Jolie's email? You betcha. I always go back to that 2007-2008 story from ABC News, where they looked into the warrantless wiretapping, and it turns out that in Iraq, we were not just listening in on so-called Al-Qaeda, we were actually listening in on our own troops' calls, and including our colonels' calls, including their private calls, and in fact, the calls that they listened to the most were phone sex calls. Because if you give 1.3 million people an opportunity to access information they shouldn't access, that's pretty much the first thing they're going to do, especially because a lot of them are dudes. Now, when you ask an establishment senator like Saxby Chambliss, he says, no way. Quote, it wouldn't just surprise me, it would shock me. I'm shocked to find there's gambling in this establishment. The NSA looking into what we would be doing in private contractors? Well, they're all angels. They would never abuse that information. It's absurd. Well, to give you a sense of how skewed Congress was in favor of the NSA, the last hearing that they had was called, quote, How Disclosed NSA Programs Protect Americans and Why Disclosure Aids Our Adversaries. I wonder if they're taking an objective look at it. So now we're going to have new hearings. It's put on by Alan Grayson. Okay, now we're having a conversation. And they're going to hear from Glenn Greenwald. And here's what Alan Grayson said, Congressman from Florida. I have been concerned about the fact that we have heard incessantly in recent weeks from General Keith Alexander, director of the NSA, and Mr. James Clapper, director of the National Intelligence, about their side of the story. We have barely heard anything in Congress from critics of the program. Well, you're about to hear from them now. So, New Day in America. And speaking of a New Day in America, all of a sudden, Congress is not so amenable to the NSA. Okay. Look, you know, we told you about that vote on Justin Amash and Conyers' bill, a Republican and Democrat, saying that we no longer want to fund the broad interpretation of Section 215 of the Patriot Act, where they spy in on all Americans. And that barely lost 205 to 217. So that was a big wake-up call to the establishment saying, hey, you know what? There's a lot of congressmen who are not happy about this on either side. Now, here's Representative Reed Ribble from Wisconsin. He said, this was in many respects a vote intended to send a message. The vote was just too strong. I like that. I like any vote that's too strong. So all of a sudden, the White House is in a little bit of panic, so is the NSA. They'd already gone into red alert on this issue. But now we begin to find out why the vote was so close in the first place. Well, it turns out many of the congressmen felt like, hey, wait a minute, we didn't even know what that 29-year-old kid Edward Snowden knew. How come the White House didn't tell us, the executive branch didn't tell us, the few congressmen and senators that were allowed to know about it didn't tell us? Zoe Lofgren says there was, quote, a grave sense of betrayal. So it's one thing when you screw over the American middle class. It's another thing when you screw over congressmen. They get pretty upset about that. So now they're thinking, hey, you know what? We're going to consider a whole bunch of new bills. One would be give more transparency for the Secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Well, that would be amazing. Number two would possibly declassify that court's orders. That would be really important, because then we get to find out what the legal basis, so-called legal basis, for these rulings are. And by the way, there's one order saying that it is not legal. That's the one we'd really like to declassify and find out what the FISA court actually said, not what the Obama administration claims they said. Another rule, changes to the way the surveillance data is stored. Well, that might be relevant in terms of who has it. In fact, the next one is data to be held by telecommunications companies that produce them or by an independent entity, not the government. So one thing, if AT&T has it, and if the authorities need it later for a specific investigation, they can go back to AT&T. A lot of people would be uncomfortable with that too, but it's a different conversation than saying the government has it all and can do whatever the hell they want with it, which a lot of people, and apparently a lot of congressmen, are unhappy about and uncomfortable with. So now, a lot of Republicans had voted against the Obama administration on this, and because of political reasons, you might not be surprised. But a good number of Democrats also peeled off because they actually care about civil liberties. And some of the libertarians probably also care about civil liberties. It's an interesting amalgamation of people. But now here comes the interesting fact that's got to have the NSA and the White House shaking their boots. There's apparently 61 wavering House Democrats who said, hey, listen, we voted with you this time. I don't know about next time, because what you're doing here seems awfully fishy, and we're very uncomfortable with it. A key moment, apparently, was when Sensenbrenner, who's a Republican and one of the co-sponsors of the Patriot Act, turned around and said, no, I'm voting with Amash and Conyers. I think that they have abused the power that we gave them, and we really need to check it. So that swung a lot of Republicans, and the Democrats are already wavering. It would be amazing if they actually checked the NSA program in a meaningful way. It wouldn't be amazing if they did a fig leaf, like, oh yeah, don't worry about it, we kind of fixed it. They can't do half of one of the 100 things they were doing before. Look away, look away. That would be perfectly normal. So just passing a bill doesn't do it. But it looks like a lot of these people are serious and might actually challenge the NSA in how much spying they do on American citizens.